Welcome to the 142nd episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with fantasy author Brad Beaulieu, author of the FLAMES of SHADAM KHOREH. Brad is also the co-host of another podcast, SPECULATE, the podcast for writers, readers, and fans. I definitely recommend Speculate. I've recently been listening to a lot of the back episodes of Speculate. They interview many fantasy and science fiction authors, really in-depth interviews, and where they discuss writing processes and writing techniques. So definitely check that out. And you can either search for it on iTunes or your favorite podcast app, or go to SpeculateSF, all one word.com. Stay tuned for the interview with Brad Beaulieu. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Bradley Beaulieu, the author of several fantasy novels, including The Flames of Shadam KHOREH, The Straits of Galahesh, and The Winds of Khalakovo. Brad, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me on. Glad to be here.
Sure. Well, can I have you read the first page or two of your new book, The Flames of Shadam KHOREH?
Yeah, certainly. So this is chapter 1 from the third book in the trilogy. Nikander grunted as he attacked the rocky red slope. He pushed as well as he was able, but he still had several hundred yards before he would reach the summit. So he stopped and leaned against a boulder, the bright color of coral. His breath left him so quickly here. A hot wind blew, picking up dust and forcing him to draw his gutra across his face. Even so, he had to squint against the dust and the bite of the sand. The wind pulled at his kaftan and the loose pants he wore beneath, until at last the wind died down. The path he was following was easy enough to spot, but it was also treacherous. It was important he be able to see far enough into the desert beyond, though. Sarush and Ushai had already been gone a day longer than planned, and he told Atiana that they would stay only one night more. If they didn't return by tomorrow morning, Atiana, Nikander, Ashan, and Sukaram would have to go into Andhakara to learn what had become of them. Behind Nikander was a vale with a meager stream running through it. They timed their entrance to the desert to take advantage of the spring rains, but the gentle weather wouldn't last much longer. It made it all the more important for them to get into the Gaji and out before it became too dry. His breath had returned. There was part of him that didn't want to complete this climb. He knew what would happen at the top. It scared him, and yet he was unable to deny the urge to go there, to look upon the desert below from such a height. So he took to the path once more. His breathing became labored halfway up, but he pushed now that he was so close. Near the top, the slope was not so brutal, but he still found it impossible to catch his breath. Eventually, however, he came to a narrow ridge. The wind was cooler. It blew more fiercely than below. Ahead of him, the red desert floor opened up. It went on forever, flat as could be. Who would have guessed that so much land could be amassed in one place? He was so used to the islands, so used to the span of the sea, that he never thought what it would be like to see something so grand and humbling as this. It was a dangerous place, but beautiful, perhaps more so because of the danger. He stared at the edge of the cliff ahead. The ridge was wide in places, but this was its highest point, and also the narrowest. Only a score of paces separated him from the edge. He stepped forward, feeling the wind against his fingertips. He took another step, felt the soles of his boots scrape. He had hoped in the days that had followed the events at the bridge on Galahesh that his sense of the wind would return to him. He had hoped that he could once more feel the touch of the Havahajan. He had hoped he could summon the wind as he once had. But the days had turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and still he felt nothing. He had tried from the towers of Galostina, and later Radaskoye. He had tried from the mountains of Uyadensk. He had tried from the perches of the Erie and the decks of wind ships, but each and every time he'd felt nothing, as was true now. He took another step forward. The wind gusted, tugging at his clothes. He breathed deep, swallowing the spit that filled his mouth now that he was so very near the edge. The desert yawned wider and wider, and yet it was not this he was most aware of, but the sheer height of this vantage. With one more long step, he reached the edge. The wind howled for a moment along the face of the cliff below. The desert seemed as wide as the sky. The ground was rocky, the vegetation sparse. The red floor of the dry plain ahead felt limitless. In the distance, below the cloudless blue sky, was a line of dark mountains, but it didn't feel like they encompassed the desert, or even obstructed it in any way. It felt as if the mountains were merely one small obstacle, and that the desert continued on, eating more of the world as it went. So that's the opening, and it goes on to show Nikander's yearning for a power he once held, and through the course of things seems to have lost.
Great. Well, if someone listening hasn't heard about your novel yet, The Flames of Shadam Khoreh, which you were just reading from, how would you describe the novel and the series, The Lays of Anastasia?
Well, it's I like to compare it a little bit to Song of Ice and Fire meets Earthsea is kind of the elevator pitch that I use. Song of Ice and Fire because George Martin was a big influence on me. I like big, epic, sweeping tales filled with gray characters. The Earthsea reference is not so much in style, but more in form. The world that the characters start out in, anyway, are in these cold, inhospitable archipelagos, and there's a lot of Russian influence in the story. I base the cultures that you deal with first largely off of Muscovite Russia and some Persian, ancient Persia and Ottoman Empire influence as well. And the story opens with a prince of the realm, Prince Nikander, who we just heard about. And in the Winds of Khalakovo, he finds a boy who may have the ability to heal a blight that's sweeping through the islands, causing a wasting disease that nobody can heal. And he also finds that there's a violent extremist sect that wants to use the same boy to cause widespread devastation. And so the story is really about this tug of war between Prince Nikander and this extremist group to unlock the boy's secrets before the other one does. And then the next two books widen the conflict. Things spread onto this mainland of Irstanla to the west of the islands that used to control them, and they've kind of set their sights there once more. So it expands from there, and the conflict expands.
Great. Well, you mentioned earlier George R.R. Martin and being inspired by the Song of Ice and Fire.
Yeah.
And obviously, with Game of Thrones, the TV series, Martin has become, in the series has become such a huge popular culture phenomenon. But, obviously the books are what started it all. I'm just curious, in your own kind of experience and in your own life, how did you originally get interested in the fantasy genre?
Well, it would have to go back to third grade was when one of my friends, Jim Vogt, I even remember his name, tipped me off to The Hobbit. He had been reading it, and I think he had been into Lord of the Rings by that point. And I found it in the library and read it and loved it. It was the first fantasy I'd come across, and I went right from there into the Lord of the Rings. And I was really just blown away by the depth of the story and just the feeling of age and antiquity, how much of a real place that it felt like, and that stuck with me throughout everything. I got into science fiction as well, but my touchstone was always really secondary world fantasy, and kind of these larger stories always attracted me.
Sure. Well, I know that in fantasy there are a lot of common tropes, quest novels, the typical European medieval setting or world. When you set out to write your series, did you have in mind that you wanted to create something unique from those kind of common themes or tropes?
Yeah, I did want to step away from things. I mean, I get kind of, I don't know, picky, maybe pedantic a little bit about not wanting to copy, other things, and I know that's impossible to do. I mean, we're all sort of following in the footsteps of those who came before, so no one's going to be writing a completely original story. But by the same token, I didn't want to sort of retread things that I had read over and over again, through my teen years and into my 20s. And it was kind of late 20s, early 30s when I was starting to get more serious, and then mid 30s by the time I started this series. And so I had tried my hand more or less at kind of the typical, Western European fantasy story. That was, one of my trunk novels was, of that type. Actually, two different trunk novels. And so I really wanted to try something different. And, the Russian angle sort of came organically from the world. I used a mapping program actually to generate it. There's an outfit that creates a program called Fractal Mapper. I get confused with Fractal Terrains, which is a different one, a competing product. But you can generate this world given certain parameters like how large it is, how much water coverage, how much rainfall, temperature, moons, on and on. And I used it to generate the archipelagos in a kind of a form that I liked, and I figured they would be kind of cold and inhospitable, and that sort of led me to Russia, something a bit different, but not too foreign from what people were used to. And then the Persian angle kind of followed from that. I wanted something that was, near enough that it would make some sense to the reader. It wouldn't be completely foreign to what they might expect from, Russian-based society. But something with a different flavor than what I had started with, just to play counterpoint to it. So yeah, I wanted to have something that was familiar. It would be off-putting to have it be completely, different than, what people sort of expect, but, with a new flavor, a new twist that they could, enjoy.
Great. Well, I know that you were a finalist in the Writers of the Future contest, and you were published in their annual anthology. What was that Writers of the Future experience like for you?
It was a lot of fun. I was actually I placed. I was more than a finalist. So they have the first, second, and third place, and then they have the published finalists as well.
Right.
So I took second place in my quarter back in 2004. And that was it was a good experience. I had been entering that. It's for those who don't know, it's a free contest that was set up by the L. Ron Hubbard and then his estate now, and it's free to enter, and those who win get flown out to a location, usually in Hollywood area where they're located, or sometimes they rove. They went to Nassau one year and some other locations over the years, and you do a workshop. And my workshop was with Katie Wentworth and Tim Powers, who has run it for quite a while, and that was a really great experience. They have some other sort of friends of the contest come in and speak to you. So Sean Williams came for the week. Jay Lake was there. Ann McCaffrey and Todd McCaffrey came in for a talk. Jerry Pornell, Charles Brown. It was a really whirlwind week when we went out there. And then they have this big sort of gala with the award ceremony. So it was wonderful. It was I had sold a single story up to that point, but to a non-paying market. So that was my first pro sale, and so it did set the bar pretty high. It was and I still keep in touch with a fair number of the people that I went to the workshop with. So that was one of the more rewarding parts too, just having this sense of group community that you can keep in touch with over the years. So have a sense of history about it. So yeah, it was nice.
Sure. sure.
I understand you went as well, right?
I did. I was there in 2001.
Okay.
So I'm curious about. I mean, you talked earlier about how you originally got interested in fantasy and reading The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and then going on from there. What was the journey like for you in terms of moving from reading the genre and reading fantasy to actually writing it? And what was you mentioned also that you had a couple of novels, as you referred to them as trunk novels. What was your path to publication like in getting your first novel published?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was a long journey for me. I went to school for computer science and engineering at the Milwaukee School of Engineering, and never at that time really thought about writing full time. I was always interested in reading, and I read almost exclusively science fiction and fantasy, mostly fantasy. And when I started going to college, I started a novel then that I never did finish, but I plotted it out. I wrote several chapters, and that I think got the ball rolling a little bit. And then at Gen Con, I grew up in Wisconsin, and I was actually very close to the Gen Con gaming convention when it was in Parkside University in Kenosha, and it moved up to Milwaukee, which is not too far away. So I would go up there, and then it moved to Indy eventually. But the Writer Symposium is a program that's been running, I think, for like 20 years at Gen Con. Started back in, I think, the Milwaukee time period, and Kiz Johnson was a writer. Mostly short fiction, but she has some novels as well. Just a beautiful writer. Love her stuff, and she's very good at passing along the craft as well. So I started going to those every year just because I was kind of curious, interested, and then she mentioned the Writers of the Future, which is why I started entering. She talked about different books and resources. I got more serious about wanting to learn, so I went to more conventions. I joined the Critters critiquing site first, and then I went to the online writing workshop, which I liked a lot better, and traded a lot of critiques, met a lot more people, learned a lot while I critiqued, and then tried to hone my craft a little bit, and then I started getting into more short stories because Kiz had mentioned that was a great way to kind of break in and advance your craft as well. And so, over the course of, 8+ years, I was writing, a few books, several short stories per year, and, starting to get more published. And then also trying to get an agent eventually. So I had a few, several nibbles over the course of those other books that didn't, quite make the cut. And I can see why now. They just weren't ready. I wasn't ready. And then the Winds of Khalakova was my debut novel, and that I actually pitched directly to Jeremy Lassen of what was then Nightshade Books. That relationship has changed now, but and he wanted to pick it up, and I got a agent after the fact. After he gave me the offer, I went and got a great agent, Russell Galen, and he worked out the arrangements for the contract, and then we got moving. So it was a slow process. It was not something that I looked at as something I really thought I could do, back in, late high school, college days. But the more the time went on, the more I kept coming back to it and wanting to tell, new stories, my stories.
Great. And you mentioned you've also written short stories. Do you have a preference in writing short stories versus novels?
Yeah, I'm a novel guy at heart, for sure. I enjoy that form a lot. I think I'm naturally more sort of attuned to that style, and probably because I didn't read a lot of short fiction when I was younger. So the sort of the cadence of and timing of a novel is sort of ingrained in me at this point. So short fiction was a tough haul for me. I have a novelist's pace, and that doesn't work well with short stories. And so I had to really work at trying to, hone things, cut things back, be more spare, start later, end sooner, cut things out in the middle, so the short story can actually work, because they're hard. Most markets, as you know, they're looking for something like 4,000 to 7,000 words is kind of the sweet spot for most markets these days. And for me, that's not the most rewarding kind of story. You hardly get into it and you're done. And I admire people that can tell a complete, whole, wonderful story in that kind of space. Kij is among them, but there's plenty of others that do great at it.
Right.
But I like it. I like it now. It's taken me a while to get to that point. To the point that I not only enjoy reading it, I enjoy writing it. But it is a bit of a battle, because I'm fighting my natural urges.
Sure. Well, we mentioned earlier how you originally read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and you also mentioned George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire. What other books or authors have inspired you over the years in terms of your own writing and interest in fantasy and science fiction?
Yeah, well, some of the early influences were when I came across Glenn Cook's Black Company series. I really love that. I was kind of used to the sort of the high and mighty view of tales, a la Tolkien, from the point of view of kings and queens, princes, that sort of thing. And that was great to get into the trenches, so to speak, with his books. Roger Zelazny. And the Amber series, was a great read for me. I really liked the first person point of view with those books, and the sort of the family dynamics that he played out. I thought he was super good at showing the different types of characters. Like through dialogue, you could just tell who was speaking. He was one of the earliest people that really struck me. And later on, Celia Friedman, C.S. Friedman, and her Coldfire trilogy had a huge influence on me. I mean, she's probably the closest person in style to me that I can point to, that's made it, really big. She's got a very serious, dark, oppressive, unrelenting, tone in those books. And it was, again, different. It was, bordering on horror. It was kind of this, dark fantasy type of tale. And I hadn't come across it before. So that was great. That had a big effect. And then I think the last person I'll mention is Guy Gavriel Kay. I think he's just wonderful prose, just beautiful, bordering on the poetic, and yet he tells a compelling tale at the same time. So I think he's one of the people that shows that there's room for poetry and prose, and I try to incorporate some of that. I'm certainly not near his level, and I don't really try to be, but I think there's space for that in novels as well.
Sure. So given your path to publication, as we discussed earlier, what advice at this point, having published 3 novels, what advice would you have for aspiring writers who are listening who may want to have their own novels or stories published?
One of my favorite pieces of advice, and it crystallized with Tim Powers, but it's been sort of reinforced over the years, and even before that, I didn't really realize it. But while I was at the Writers of the Future Week out in Hollywood, Tim said that we were going to write a story in 24 hours. That was our assignment. And everybody sort of blanched, at that notion, because we're used to doing it in weeks, not a day, certainly. And he gave us tips for how to do that. And this is a common thing that you probably saw as well, where Tim gives you a random thing, and that's supposed to be used in your book. So I got a key. And that could be like a musical key. It didn't have to be a literal interpretation, and that's what I did. I used it as like a musical key for the story that I created. And then we also have to go outside onto Hollywood Boulevard and just start talking to random people until eventually, inevitably, they'll tell you something that's interesting about themselves, and that's kind of a cue. That tells you that you can do that with really anything. It doesn't have to be people. It could be stories that you read. It could be nonfiction articles. It could be an NPR show that you're listening to. Whatever. Things come up, and you should grab those things and use them. So we all wrote our stories, and then Tim said, because we don't have as much time, we have a lot of things we're doing this week, we're not going to critique all of the stories. We're only going to critique 3 of them. And they picked the stories, and mine wasn't one of them. And I was crestfallen. And he said, don't be disappointed. You will find over your career that you will learn much more from critiquing work and then having other people critique the same work and finding the things that you miss, because those will identify your blind spots. And so I've used that. I haven't used it over and over again. It's just something that happens, but it's important, I think, to recognize that and then start to notice your blind spots. And then the other piece that goes along with this, once you kind of know what your strengths and weaknesses are, and you want to start working on things. I went to Clarion in 2006, and Sam Delaney, Chip Delaney, was our first instructor, and he said that it's not sufficient to just write, because you can have bad habits, and you will be reinforcing those bad habits if all you do is blindly write words on a page. You have to look at what you're doing, analyze yourself, find those things that you're not very good at, and then actively work to strengthen those mental muscles. So I would say my biggest piece of advice is to get better at learning your weaknesses, and that's not just from people critiquing you. That's from you critiquing other people's stuff and having other people do it too. And you can do that at live workshops. You can do it at places like the online writing workshop. You can do it at workshops that you host, locally with local writers. But once you identify those things, then make a plan to work on those things, and that's why short stories are great, because they're short form. You can knock them out in a few days, a week, and start to work on those things that aren't working for you, and that'll just help build your craft over time. And these things will start to work synergistically. You'll be working on a fight scene or something, and you'll intersperse some dialogue, and that will help your dialogue, come along, and vice versa. So it's I would say that.
Great. What are you working on next?
I sold a trilogy to DAW Books recently. While I was working on the 3rd book, the Flames of Shadam KHOREH, that just came out, I put together a proposal, and we sold to Betsy Woolheim at DAW in spring, and that is due December of this year. So I'm about 2/3 of the way through that book, and it's a trilogy about a kick-ass female pit fighter who rises up to challenge the rule of the 12 kings of the desert, who rule with an iron fist. So it's in a kind of a reimagined Arabian Nights tales sort of world.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's I'm really enjoying it. I'm getting to the close to the climax, or at least I'm at the top of the hill, getting ready to roll all the boulders down. So it's a fun time in that book right now.
That's great. So are you writing full time now, or do you have a day job as well?
Yeah, I wish I was writing full time for sure. But no, not yet. That's the hope. But I'm working. I work for IBM as a software consultant, so I'm still in the IT software world. And oddly enough, that it doesn't interfere so much with my my writing in terms of mental exhaustion. Some people say that they have a day job that's creative, and when they get home, they're mentally exhausted, and that part of their brain can't function anymore, or at least very well. So it works out fairly well for me. I steal time at night after the kids are in bed and get my hour or so of writing in, and that works for now.
Great. And so where can people find you online if they're interested in learning more about you and your books?
I have a website at quillings.com. That's QUILLINGS.com. And I'll put a plug in for another podcast. So we are brothers in the podcast realm. I run a podcast called SPECULATE with Greg Wilson, a fellow author. And you can find that at speculatesf.com.
Great. And I'll have a link to that in the show notes as well.
Great.
I haven't had a chance to listen to that podcast yet, but I just added it to my podcasting app and look forward to listening to it soon. So,
yeah, great.
Great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Brad Beaulieu, the author of The Flames of Shadam Khoreh, which is available in bookstores now. Brad, thanks for doing the interview.
Yeah, great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Sure.
You should be saving for the future, but savings accounts suck, and investing can be scary. We combine the ease of savings with the real returns of investing. We call it Save Vesting, and it's only available in our new app, Stairs. Stairs offers 4 to 6% returns, no fees, and you can withdraw anytime. Do your future a favor. Visit stairsapp.com today.